Gold, marble, endless gardens. From the outside, the Palace of Versailles looked like paradise, a royal dream frozen in time. But behind the glittering chandeliers and lavish ceremonies, daily life at Versailles was anything but comfortable. Hi guys, and thanks for tuning in. Tonight we're going to be talking about the shocking truths of what it was really like living in the Palace of Versailles. From its lavish parties to its horrific stench. But before we dive in, if you enjoy this story, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. Get in your comfy place, and let's get started. Today, millions visit Versailles each year to marvel at its grandeur. But the experience of living there, especially day to day, was far more complex than most people imagine. Imagine living in a 2,300-room palace with no central heating, sharing space with hundreds of nobles, servants, and even strangers. And yes, very few bathrooms. So what was it really like to live in the most luxurious palace in Europe? Today, we're peeling back the velvet curtain to explore the beauty, discomfort, strict etiquette, and surprising realities of life inside Versailles. To understand life at Versailles, we need to understand how it became the epicenter of French royal life in the first place. Our story begins in 1623 when King Louis XIII built a modest hunting lodge in the village of Versailles, about 20 kilometers southwest of Paris. Quiet, remote, nothing like the palace we know today. But everything changed under his son, Louis XVI, the Sun King. In the 1660s, Louis embarked on an ambitious project, transforming his father's humble lodge into a palace that would reflect the full glory of his reign. And it worked. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a colossal statement of power. But building that statement came at an equally colossal cost. Estimates vary, but historians believe the construction and decoration of the Palace of Versailles cost anywhere from 100 to 300 million livres, the equivalent of several billion US dollars today, and that's not including the maintenance or the cost of hosting thousands of courtiers. At the peak of the construction under Louis XVI, up to 30,000 workers, including soldiers, slaves, artists, craftsmen, gardeners, and engineers, toiled on the site. Many of them lived in harsh conditions, laboring for years to realize the king's vision of perfection. Despite the overwhelming size, Versailles wasn't designed like a modern building. It had around 300 to 400 private apartments, but not all of them were bedrooms, and even fewer had proper plumbing. In fact, for much of its history, the palace had very few bathrooms by modern standards, and most people relied on chamber pots, or simply the gardens. Living space wasn't guaranteed, even for nobles. Rooms were tightly packed, often shared and assigned by royal favor. You want privacy? That was a luxury, even in the king's house. So while Versailles dazzled from the outside, life inside was a very different story. Let's take a closer look at what daily life was really like inside the palace for kings, queens, nobles, and servants alike. At Versailles, even waking up was political. For the royal family, especially the king, daily life followed a rigid, ceremonial routine designed to reinforce the divine power of the monarchy. The most famous example, the lever, or the king's morning waking ceremony. Each morning, around 8 a.m., the first valet de chambre woke the king. Then, in a carefully choreographed procession, nobles of varying rank were admitted to assist with each part of the king's morning, washing his hands, serving his clothing, even handing him his shoes. Everything had a rank, a privilege, a protocol. Only those of high status and royal favor were allowed into the grand livre, and just being present was considered a mark of prestige. This is how nobles gained influence, not in meetings, but in moments like these, helping the king put on his wig or hand him his shirt. The queen had her own version of the ceremony, though typically more private. Still, favored ladies of the court were invited to attend the Livre de la Reine, watching or helping as she was dressed and prepared for the day. After the Livre, the king's day was packed. Mass in the chapel, meetings with ministers, public appearances, formal meals, all done under the watchful eyes of nobles and courtiers. The king was never truly alone. Even his meals were made public. His royal dinner was performed in front of an audience. People would crowd in to watch the king and the queen eat, not speak to them, not dine with them, just watch. In the evening, the process was reversed. The king's going to bed ceremony was just as formal. Nobles lined up once again to say goodnight, because at Versailles, every moment of the royal routine was a chance to see, be seen, and climb the social ladder. It may have looked glamorous, but life in the royal spotlight came at a cost. Privacy was rare, spontaneity was discouraged, and every day was a performance. Even the clothing worn in the palaces were strict, and everyone in the palace had to dress the part. At Versailles, clothing wasn't just fashion, it was politics. Every ruffle, ribbon, and jewel signaled your rank, your loyalty, and your place in the royal pecking order. For the queen and the ladies of the court, dressing was both a ritual and a burden. Outfits were regulated by strict codes, not only for ceremonies and appearances, but sometimes even by the time of day. Take the formal gown. A lady might wear a linen shift, a stiffened corset, massive side hoops to widen the hips, a heavily adorned gown, and heels, all before jewelry, makeup, and wigs. Some gowns could weigh over 20 pounds, and sitting down gracefully was an art form in and of itself. Even the queen had little freedom in what she wore. Every morning, she was dressed in full view of select courtiers. Each piece of clothing was handed to her in a strict order of rank. Only a duchess could present her with her skirt, for example. And wearing anything too simple, too extravagant, or not in fashion could be seen as a political statement. Men weren't exempt either. Court dress for men meant embroidered silk coats, tight breeches, stockings, powdered wigs, and heels, often with red soles reserved for nobility. Appearance mattered more than comfort. In summer, these outfits would be unbearable. The palace had no air conditioning, or even decent airflow for that matter, and most fabrics were heavy and unbreathable. Corsets restricted breathing, wigs caused itching, and shoes pinched and blistered. To the outside world, the court of Versailles looked like elegance perfected, but behind the lace and the silk was a daily struggle to move, breathe, and endure, all in the name of status. It's no wonder Marie Antoinette eventually rebelled, retreating to her private estate and ditching court fashion for lighter, looser gowns, a decision that scandalized the court and further damaged her public image. At Versailles, even your clothes were a performance, and comfort was always second to appearance. Speaking of comfort, beneath the gold leaf and crystal chandeliers, the palace, it stank, literally. With over 3,000 people living at Versailles during its peak, human waste was an inescapable part of daily life. Versailles may have looked like the height of royal luxury, but breathe in too deeply, and the illusion quickly faded. There were very few bathrooms, at least not the kind you'd imagine. Chamber pots were tucked behind furniture, dumped into fireplaces, or emptied out windows into courtyards below. Yes, people walking the grounds had to watch for falling waste. Waste disposal was crude. Human and kitchen waste collected in pits or trenches, often left to rot for weeks. During summer, the heat made the smell unbearable. One visitor described the palace as reeking of filth under all its finery. To cope, people carried around perfumed handkerchiefs or wore sachets of herbs and flowers. Rooms were doused in strong-smelling incense, and wigs were powdered to mask the unpleasant odors. Servants were constantly emptying chamber pots, hundreds of them, but with no running water or modern plumbing, even their best efforts barely kept up. Some corridors were known as public urinals, especially at night, when people didn't want to wander to find a pot or wake a servant. Even the grand staircase was reportedly used as a bathroom on more than one occasion. It may have been a palace fit for a king, but behind the perfume, protocol, the smell told a very different story. Versailles wasn't just a royal palace, it was a noble hive. At its peak, more than 1,000 nobles and officials lived at court full-time, often with their families. Everyone wanted a room at Versailles, not for the comfort, but for the access. Living close to the king meant you were visible, influential, and potentially rewarded. But with that came a strange price. You were to play by the palace's rules and often hold a job that was more theater than work. There were some people in the palace that were responsible for helping the king put on his coat, or people who handed the king his shirt. Each position was a symbol of trust, no matter how trivial it seemed. The ladies in waiting didn't escape this either. Some were responsible for handing the queen her gloves, or standing beside her as she brushed her teeth. Some of the titles sounded impressive, but mostly were just ceremonial. Their real purpose? To allow noble families to say, "We serve the king." Others had no job at all, just the constant work of being present. In the world of Versailles, showing up was a full-time career. Nobles spent hours waiting in salons, following the king through hallways, or trying to catch his eye during a hunt or a meal. A well-timed compliment, a deep bow, a shared joke, these were the tools of survival. Forget merit or talent. Court life was about visibility and favor. With every noble came staff, valets, dressers, tutors, cooks. The palace became a never-ending performance where hierarchy controlled everything, from who got to sit or who could enter a room first. Some titles were passed down, others were bought for massive sums, and in the end, the actual work didn't really matter, but the title did, because at Versailles, a ridiculous job was better than no job at all. It was all part of Louis XVI's plan: surround himself with nobles, keep them busy with ceremony, and keep their ambition in check. After all, if they were fighting over who handed the king a napkin, they weren't plotting a rebellion. As if you don't think life at the palace could get any weirder. Trust me, it does. We all know that Versailles was home to kings, queens, and nobles, but it was also home to something a little more unexpected: exotic animals. Peacocks on the terraces, monkeys in embroidered vests, parrots screeching from gilded cages. For the royal court, pets weren't just companions. They were a show of wealth, power, and prestige. Foreign ambassadors often brought live animals as diplomatic gifts to impress the French crown, including lions, ostriches, camels, and even an elephant. These creatures were more than curiosities. They were living trophies of France's global influence. Some animals became beloved and spoiled, members of court life. Louis's daughters reportedly kept monkeys dressed in miniature court outfits. They were fed delicacies, trained to perform tricks, and even escorted around the palace. Ladies at court kept lapdogs, parrots, and even squirrels as fashionable accessories. One duchess was said to have taught her parrot to insult her rivals by name. But animals, of course, don't follow etiquette. There are stories of monkeys stealing wigs, parrots interrupting official ceremonies, and peacocks squawking through chapel services. Palace staff were tasked with managing the chaos, feeding the creatures, repairing damage, and occasionally cleaning up messes that were not exactly courtly. For all its rules, Versailles always left room for spectacle, and sometimes that meant letting a monkey in a waistcoat steal the show. From above, the Palace of Versailles looked like it could house a small city, but step inside and you'd be surprised at just how crowded it really was. At its peak, Versailles was home to upwards of 10,000 people, including the royal family, nobles, guards, musicians, artists, servants, cooks, valet, and even their families. That's not a palace. That's a population. The palace had over 2,300 rooms, but many were dark and small and windowless. Not every noble got a glamorous apartment. Most lived in cramped quarters, tucked into unused closets, attic spaces, and even makeshift storage rooms. Some nobles, desperate to live at court, shared rooms with their servants, spouses, and even rivals. There were no private bathrooms, and privacy was almost non-existent. For servants, it was even worse. Most slept wherever they could find space, under stairwells, in linen closets, even in hallways. Some never even had a real bed. Versailles was a maze of elbow-to-elbow living, where noise never stopped and the line between public and private life was almost erased. You were always on display, even when you were trying to sleep. Despite the gilded ceilings and the velvet curtains, many rooms were cold, damp, and poorly ventilated. Rodents were a constant problem, so were insects. And in the winter, you could literally see your breath in bed. Room assignments were based on favor, not fairness. A better apartment meant you'd caught the king's eye, even if someone else had lived there for years. The palace was always alive, always crowded, and always loud. And while Versailles projected control and grandeur inside its walls, it often felt more like organized chaos. It may have been the heart of French power, but for thousands crammed inside Versailles, it was less like a palace and more like a royal pressure cooker. What also didn't help the immensely crowded halls was that, believe it or not, anyone could walk inside. Yes, at the height of its glory, the Palace of Versailles was open to the public. If you were decently dressed and knew the etiquette, you could just stroll right in. No invitation, no security clearance, just walk right in, right off the street, and into the heart of all that royal power. This wasn't generosity, it was strategy. King Louis XVI, he wanted to be seen. Versailles was his stage, and the public was part of the audience. By letting commoners witness the rituals of power, the king's waking, his meals, his chapel visits, he reinforced his image as a living god. Tourists, beggars, foreigners, all could visit the palace. Some came to marvel, others came to petition the king for favors, jobs, or justice. A few just came to gawk at the nobility, who were always performing, even when pretending not to notice. Of course, not everyone was welcome. You needed to dress properly, usually in a hat, clean shoes, and presentable clothing. Those who looked too poor or too dirty or too disruptive might be turned away. But let's be honest, the bar was really low. Imagine trying to host a royal dinner while dozens of strangers watched you eat, or being a duchess followed down the hallway by tourists whispering about your jewels. It was Versailles' strange paradox, impossibly elite, yet shockingly accessible. And that openness came at a price. Spies, thieves, and revolutionaries could walk the halls too, observing the waste, the wealth, and the arrogance. Versailles showed off its glory and unknowingly fed the seeds of resentment. To the loyals, it may have felt like control. To the people, it was a peek behind the curtain. And by the late 1700s, they were no longer just watching, they were judging. Versailles welcomed the people for decades, but in 1789, they returned, not to admire the monarchy, but to tear it down. Speaking of pressure cookers, when you have that many people living under one roof, how do you feed them all? At Versailles, food was theater, lavish, extravagant, public. But behind every royal meal was an army of cooks, servants, and staff working under intense pressure in conditions that were anything but refined. The palace had some of the most talented chefs in Europe, but they worked in kitchens far from dining rooms, sometimes several hundred feet away. That meant food often arrived cold, despite its elegance. Preparations began before sunrise. By midday, the kitchens were sweltering, with hundreds, sometimes thousands of mouths to feed. The staff prepared multiple courses, featuring dozens of dishes, roasted meats, pastries, soups, exotic fruits, and imported delicacies. There were specialized workers for everything, from meat carvers and pastry chefs to spice mixers, wine stewards, and ice collectors. Some dishes took days to prepare. Once ready, food was placed on elaborate silver and porcelain and rushed to the royal table. But with such distance to cover and no warming stations, most food arrived lukewarm at best. Royal meals, like the Grand Couvert, were public events. The king and the queen dined under the gaze of the court, not in conversation, but as a performance. Nobles lined up just to watch them eat. Speaking to the king during dinner? Unthinkable, unless you were summoned. Not everyone dined like royalty. Many nobles living in the palace had to fend for themselves. Those without high status or royal favor were served cold leftovers, simple fare, or, if they missed the right time, nothing at all. Servants and kitchen staff ate separately, often in shifts, on the floor, or standing. With thousands to feed and dishes to scrub, mealtimes were short and chaotic. Food at Versailles was grand, yes, but it was also messy, late, cold, and often wasteful. Leftovers were sometimes fed to the poor, but just as often, they were thrown away. At Versailles, meals were more about image than nourishment, another ritual in the daily performance of power. Now, we've talked about the enormous amount of people who lived in the palace, their cramped conditions, how they ate, but what about the cleanliness of the palace? Surely, with all the staff who lived in the palace, it was kept in pristine condition. Well, if you thought that, you would be sadly wrong. Versailles dazzled visitors with gold, crystal, and polished marble, a palace that reflected the absolute power of the French monarchy. But beneath the shine was dirt, dust, rot, and an army of servants working day and night to hide it. Keeping Versailles clean was a never-ending battle. With over 700 rooms, 2,000 plus windows, and thousands of residents, the palace functioned more like a busy train station than a royal retreat. There were no vacuums, no plumbing, no electricity, just human hands, stiff brushes, buckets, and rags. The palace had hundreds of fireplaces, all of which had to be cleaned daily. Every morning, maids collected chamber pots, swept up ashes, and replaced linens. Much of the decor, the gold leaf, the carved ceilings, the massive mirrors, was beautiful, but impossible to clean easily, and dust never stopped falling. Keeping the palace shiny wasn't about sanitation. It was all about appearances. Even the gardens had their own cleaning crews. With hundreds of fountains, sculptures, and walkways, Versailles outdoor spaces required constant upkeep. Leaves, mud, animal droppings, remember those exotic animals? All had to be cleared before the king's next promenade. Then there was the waste. With so few bathrooms, servants were tasked with emptying chamber pots, sometimes hundreds a day, and scrubbing floors soiled by nobles, guests, and even animals. Odors were common, and cleaning supplies, well, they were limited. To cope, servants used vinegar, herbs, and scented water, but nothing truly masked the stench. In some parts of the palace, floors were covered in straw or rushes to soak up spills and waste. Not exactly the elegance we imagine today. Versailles was enormous, but it wasn't airtight. Leaks, mold, crumbling plaster, and vermin were common. And repairs? Well, expensive, slow, and often ignored unless they affected the king's own rooms. Behind every glittering hall was a world of quiet, grueling labor. Cleaning Versailles took hundreds of hands, and no matter how hard they worked, the palace, it never stayed clean for long. In the palace of perfection, cleanliness was just another illusion, constantly polished, constantly undone. At Versailles, nothing was done halfway, or at least when it comes to entertainment anyway. And when it came to it, the grandest of all were the royal balls, lavish, late-night spectacles that blended politics, fashion, flirtation, and exhaustion. Getting ready was a production of its own. Ladies wore gowns that weighed up to 30 pounds, with side hoops so wide they had to turn sideways to walk through doorways. Men arrived in embroidered coats, silk stockings, and heels, their hair towering with powder and pomade. The evening typically began with a minuet, a slow, stately dance where every bow, every step, every glance was choreographed. This wasn't dancing for fun. It was dancing as diplomacy. One misstep could cost you your social standing. When the king appeared, the entire room changed. No one could begin dancing until he did. He might open the ball with a partner of his choosing, often a duchess or ambassador's wife, a choice that sent silent messages to the entire court. The balls could last 6, 8, or even 12 hours, with breaks for drinks, snacks, and whispered gossip. But no one left early. Being seen was more important than being rested. By midnight, wigs were askew, corsets were tight, feet were blistered, but the dancing, well, it continued. Under King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, balls became even more elaborate, sometimes held in the Hall of Mirrors, sometimes outdoors in the gardens under torchlight. These events were theatrical showcases, complete with costumes, masks, and live orchestras. By the time dawn arrived, only the most ambitious or most intoxicated, remained on the dance floor. Servants discreetly swept around heels. Guests stumbled back to their rooms, and the palace fell silent until it all began again the next night. At Versailles, a ball wasn't just a party, it was a performance of power, where every glance, every gown, and every dance step had meaning, and everyone, from the king to the newest courtier, was expected to play their part. So after all of that partying, wouldn't you want to get away for a bit? Maybe take in some fresh air? Go to a cafe? Collect your thoughts? You think that living in the Palace of Versailles, with all its beauty, parties, pageantry, would feel like a dream, but for many courtiers, it felt more like a trap. Most courtiers didn't stay at Versailles out of comfort or its lavish parties. They stayed because they were afraid to leave. Why? Because everything at Versailles involved being seen by the king. Influence, favors, promotions, pensions, marriage alliances, they all depended on visibility. If you weren't there when the king looked your way, well, someone else was. King Louis XVI, the Sun King, designed the court like a living clock. He expected loyalty, attendance, and participation in his rituals, and that meant being ready at all hours to smile, bow, serve, or flatter. Even a few days away could mean losing access, status, or favor. In fact, some nobles lived cramped, uncomfortable rooms for years just to stay close to power. Leaving meant risking obscurity. It happened all the time. A courtier would leave for a family visit or a state business and come back to find that they'd been replaced. A new favorite now occupied their room, their role, their future. That's why many never left. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years. They attended every event, every ceremony, every meal. Because absence was risk, and Versailles didn't forgive forgettable people. Versailles may have had golden gates and endless gardens, but for the courtiers trapped in its politics, it often felt like a gilded prison. But it wasn't just the courtiers who were afraid to leave. It was pretty much, well, everyone, even those who had the most mundane and ridiculous jobs. At Versailles, power wasn't just shown through palaces and parades, it was shown through jobs. And the more absurd the job, the more prestigious it could be. Let's start with one of the most sought-after honors, the noble whose duty was to present the king with bread. That's it. No baking, no slicing, just holding it, preferably with style. Then there was the person whose job it was to help the king get dressed. You think a valet is just a servant job, but no. This role was highly political. Whoever handed the king his shirt could become incredibly influential. Another real job? The keeper of the king's cushions. This courtier ensured the king's chairs, stools, and yes, bed pillows were fluffed, placed, and perfectly positioned. Heaven forbid His Majesty sit without the appropriate cushion ceremony. Ladies in waiting had jobs like handing the queen her gloves or standing silently as she brushed her teeth. One woman might hold a towel, another, her comb. Each action had its own assigned rank. One of the stranger jobs, a nobleman who followed the king with a portable stool, so His Majesty could sit at any moment. Standing tired? Not the king, never. And yes, there was a royal spoon holder, a goblet carrier, and even someone called the Grand Groom of the Stool who oversaw the king's personal hygiene, a surprisingly intimate and highly trusted role. These jobs may seem ridiculous now, but at Versailles, they were everything. Being close to the king, even just to hold his gloves, meant status, favor, and influence. Speaking of ridiculous, King Louis XVI was also known for making ridiculous and over-the-top personal requests to his servants at the Palace of Versailles. When Louis XVI wasn't quite as showy as his great-great-grandfather, his lifestyle was still steeped in absurd rituals and demands, many of which felt downright surreal today. Being King of France wasn't just about ruling for the country. For Louis XVI, it was about being waited on for every single tiny thing, even the things that he could have easily done himself. Let's start simple. Louis XVI had a servant assigned just to put on his shoes. Not because he couldn't, he just didn't. Why bend over when 4 noblemen are standing by you and they'll do it for you? Every morning, Louis followed a strict ritual called the lever, or ceremonial waking. And nothing was private. Servants would stand in line to help him get out of bed, put on his socks, even go to the bathroom. At meals, it continued. The king had servants assigned just to cut his meat, wipe his mouth, and blow on his soup to cool it. Imagine being a grown man needing royal assistance to just eat dinner. If Louis wanted to sit down, a servant would rush over to the place and put a chair behind him. Even something as simple as sitting required a ceremony. And if a cushion wasn't fluffed correctly, well, that could become the next scandal. Yes, you heard that right. He even had a royal groom of the stool, an actual job title. This servant was responsible for helping the king when nature called. And it wasn't just about wiping, it was all about timing, announcing, and properly disposing. The king also had very specific cravings. He was known to request hot chocolate at odd hours, and of course, it had to be brought up with all the ceremony of a royal banquet. When Louis took a nap, the entire wing of the palace had to stay silent. Courtiers couldn't walk too loudly, servants tiptoed, even gardeners were told not to trim hedges near his windows. But perhaps the weirdest quirk of all, Louis had a personal obsession with locks and keys. He often summoned his locksmith just to watch him work, sometimes interrupting court business to do so. To be king meant never lifting a finger, unless it was a signal for someone else to lift it for you. For Louis XVI, life at Versailles wasn't just royal, it was ridiculously royal. And you wonder why there was a revolution. But we can't just give Louis all the attention. How about Marie Antoinette? If Louis XVI life at Versailles was ceremonial and stiff, Marie Antoinette's was theatrical and rebellious. She didn't follow tradition. She danced around it, powdered it, and dressed it in silk. Like the king, she had a formal morning routine. Courtiers watched her get dressed, not for fun, but for rank. Only a few elite ladies were allowed to hand her a sleeve, a ribbon, a petticoat, and even that was social competition. It was so ridiculous that if a duchess entered the room halfway through, everyone had to stop, because she outranked the others and earned the right to hold the next piece of clothing. But unlike Louis, Marie Antoinette, she hated being watched. As soon as possible, she'd retreat to her private chambers, or better yet, to her fantasy escape, the Petit Trianon. At the Petit Trianon, a small palace gifted to her by the king, she ruled alone. No etiquette, no crowds, no nobles she didn't like. She could eat when she wanted, she could dress casually, and she could invite only her inner circle. Her most controversial escape? Her mock peasant village. There, she dressed like a shepherdess, milked clean cows, and hosted picnics. It was play-acting rural life, while still being watched on by her servants. While Louis was fascinated by locks, hunting, and carpentry, Marie Antoinette was obsessed with fashion, theater, and escaping court life. She spent enormous sums of money on dresses, jewels, and wigs, and was often seen as frivolous and out of touch. The people of France watched all of this with growing anger. Her expensive tastes and preference for privacy earned her the nicknames like Madame Deficit, even though, ironically, Louis spent more on state affairs and war. Marie Antoinette wasn't cold-hearted, but she was raised in luxury, married into a gilded cage, and tried to decorate it into something softer. Her habits weren't worse than the king's, they were just more visible. And visibility, at Versailles, was everything. She wanted freedom, but at Versailles, even the queen couldn't escape the performance. Also, side note, let me guys know if you want me to make a video dedicated to Marie Antoinette. So now that we know a little bit more about the king and Marie Antoinette, let's pull back the curtain on the people behind the glamour, who made royal life possible, and who lived very different lives. When we imagine life at Versailles, we picture kings in gold-embroidered coats, queens in towering wigs, and rooms dripping with crystal and silk. But behind the spectacle lived an invisible army, the hundreds of servants who made that royal illusion possible. They didn't live in luxury. They worked through it. Some lived inside the palace in tiny, freezing attic rooms, sharing beds, or sleeping under staircases. Others walked miles each day from the nearby town just to start their shifts before sunrise. Their job was simple: never be noticed unless you were needed. To be late or visible in the wrong hallway could mean punishment or dismissal. Versailles ran on precision and fear. The royal kitchens alone employed over 300 people: bakers, butchers, scullions. They worked in brutal heat, surrounded by fire and sweat, making lavish meals they weren't allowed to eat. There were washermen tasked with cleaning endless gowns, corsets, and linens, many of which had to be bleached by hand in freezing water. One wrong move, and you'll be blamed for ruining royal property. The king had valets for dressing, servants to hold his cup, and even a man whose sole task was to watch over the royal chamber pot. It sounds absurd, but these roles were highly controlled, and any mistake could end your career. There are stories of servants who dropped plates or stepped out of line and were fired on the spot, or worse, publicly humiliated. They worked 16-hour days, no holidays, no applause, just the daily pressure of keeping the palace spotless, the royals pleased, and the machine of Versailles running without a sound. They were everywhere, and yet no one saw them. They lit the chandeliers, laid out the robes, held the doors open for nobles who never learned their names. Versailles was built to glorify kings, but it was held up by the servants, unseen, uncelebrated, and utterly essential. The Palace of Versailles remains one of the most breathtaking monuments to royal ambition the world has ever seen. But behind the shimmering mirrors and silk-lined walls were drafty rooms, aching feet, overflowing chamber pots, and thousands of lives spent performing power every single day. For all of its beauty, Versailles was never truly about comfort. It was about control, illusion, and status. A place where appearances were everything, and reality was often hidden behind velvet curtains. Centuries later, we're fascinated not just by what Versailles was, but by what it tried to be. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to like and subscribe, and join me for next time as we uncover the truth behind the world's most iconic places. And for those of you still up, I'll tend to the fire a little bit longer, hoping the sounds of the crackling fire will help put you to sleep. Bye, guys.